Horror on the radio emerged in the United States during the 1930s and immediately offered audience members an exciting form of entertainment. These horror radio shows were appealing to listeners by allowing them to imagine the scenes described by the story. This often allowed for more suspense and excitement than horror film at the time. Film was limited by the technology the movies were shot with and offered low-quality scenes. This often diminished the horror of the storyline to audience members, whereas an auditory experience made listeners imagine themselves in the story, creating a more realistic horror story for the audience. Early horror radio shows featured a set radio host telling horror stories based from novels or short stories. One of the early popular horror radio shows was Witch's Tale. That featured the old Nancy and her cat, Satan, as the hosts. Here's a clip from one of the shows.
Now draw up to the fire and gaze into the embers. Gaze into 'em deep, and soon you'll be down south with us in old Louisiana. It's strange country down there, ghost country. And outside a little railway depot there begins our...
The War of the Worlds was a radio drama that was an adaptation of H.G. Wells' book, The War of the Worlds. The drama was presented in a way to where any listeners who had missed the announcement of it being a drama would have believed what was happening to be real events. The radio would be playing music, and all of a sudden, the music would be stopped to alert people of events happening, starting with mysterious explosions happening on Mars, ending with aliens invading New York. During the days after the radio drama, the media was outraged and ended up calling for regulation by the FCC. From the 1930s through the 1950s, America's host imaginative horror and sci-fi stories came alive each night on radio. Listeners would experience awesome adventures, shocking thrills, and incredible flights of fantasy, all with their mind's eye. By the early 1960s, however, television had robbed radio of most of its actors, writers, and ultimately its audience. But neither TV nor film have ever been able to invade the brains of those it entertained like radio did. It was there that radio worked its greatest magic, conjuring up strange new worlds and amazing tales of terror, and it did it all with words, sounds, and the listener's own imagination. Modern horror radio has turned more to podcasts. These podcasts are a person telling a story to the listeners, trying to get the listener's imagination involved in the listening. An example of modern horror podcasts is Small Town Horror.
Every town has its stories, its secrets. What possible harm could come from sharing them? This is Small Town Horror.
In this podcast, the story is of a girl and a boy going to an abandoned home in a small town. The podcast tells the story while using sound effects to make the listener feel as if they were with the characters in the story. The whole time the podcast is going, the listener is supposed to feel as if the characters are talking to them. The story is a letter to a friend of the characters telling her that everything that happened is her fault. The story is told in different voices and with different tones to make the listener feel like they are in the story and to add dramatic effect. Just like in the 1930s, modern horror podcasts aim to make the reader's imagination come alive and allow them to see the story how they want to see it. That is done using emotion in the voice of the reader, the sound effects to make the listener feel as if they were in the story, and telling a story in a way that allows the listener to use their imagination to make the story come alive in their own way. Yay!